last year.
Yeah, but not since then. So you have some new committee members.
Right.
Yeah, we should probably round of introduction. Why don't you start?
Sure. Michelle Boslin. I represent Wyndham 3 in Northern Wyndham County.
Greg Bird from Cabot, Danville, and Houston.
I remember you left it. John O'Brien, Windsor Orange One, that's where I opened in my hometown.
And David Durfee, I live in Shaftesbury, Sunderland and Glastonbury as well.
I'm Leland Morgan. I represent all of Grand Isle County, the 5 towns there, and a little bit of part of Westmoat.
And Representative Supernaut is joining us online. I'm not sure whether she's able to introduce herself, but.
Yes, I am. Good afternoon. Sorry for not being there in person. I represent Windsor 4, the towns of Barnard, Pomfret, Bridgewater, West Hartford.
And Nelson had to head back to his operation, and Representative Lipsky, who you may remember from last year, may be joining us. So we're going to hear just a little bit from Emily May with the Xerxes Society. Did I pronounce that correctly? Mm-hmm. Who asked to speak on the draft rule that we took a look at, maybe it's a couple of weeks ago now, on Act 182. That was the neonic bill from last session. And there's a rule that was drafted. It goes through a convoluted process, doesn't require our committee to do anything, but I think it's helpful for us to know if there are concerns out there as it moves through the process. And you're welcome to speak to the process too, because our memories are on something complicated like that, maybe not perfect.
Can you remember what was the bill number?
76, I think, last year. 706. So, yeah, each 706. All right. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. So thank you for the opportunity to testify on World Bee Day. Happy World Bee Day.
Bee Day. Okay.
Yep. My name is Emily May. I'm the Agricultural Conservation Lead with the Pesticide Program at the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And since there's folks new here, we are a nonprofit organization, science-driven, working with growers and other land managers to conserve pollinators in Vermont and also around the country. My personal background is in agricultural entomology, and my focus is on conservation of working lands. And so I also, just so you know, shared this testimony with Andrew Munkers, who's a beekeeper, Lemon Fair Honey Works, longtime beekeeper and policy liaison for Vermont Beekeepers Association. He's not able to join us today because it's one of the 2 busiest days for him with his bees in the field. But VBA members are deeply invested in making sure that this bill ends up being meaningful for protection of their bees. So, over the last 2 years, we've engaged regularly with the Agency of Agriculture through the Agricultural Innovation Board, including submitting best management practice recommendations around use of neonic seed treatments and neonic pesticides as kind of a reference template for the rulemaking that they're doing. And that was those BMPs that we provided to the AIB were co-signed by extension researchers from Cornell, from UVM, as well as from Quebec. So our goal is really just to help shape a rule that's meaningful, that is grounded in science, and that's also feasible for growers. So I just want to start because I don't know how many of you are thinking about this bill as it went through last year, but the intent behind the bill, what the rule is meant to implement. The bill was passed because of considerable evidence that neonicotinoid insecticides contribute to pollinator declines, contribute to bird declines, pose serious risks to aquatic ecosystems. And in Vermont, the neonic seed treatments are the largest contributor to insecticide use in the state. So these are long-lasting and systemic, meaning very water-soluble insecticides that move into plants, they move into water, and they are often used prophylactically without evidence that there's a documented need for them for a pest reason. And then they show up in our water and our soil and our plants for months after application. So the law really was trying to provide its multi-year timeline in order to let growers and agencies and scientists adapt and get ready for the implementation, and place some sideboards on that routine and prophylactic use of the neonic treated seed that research is showing is really not providing an economic benefit in corn in particular and soybean. So I think from my perspective, one of the most critical pieces of this is helping Vermont growers using treated seeds to implement better IPM. And that's happening. Heather Darby at UVM Extension is implementing ongoing field trials that have expanded this year, looking at treated seed versus alternatives. So the research is ongoing to be able to help make better informed decisions in a system that currently doesn't offer a lot of choice. Treated seeds are really baked into the supply chain, and growers can't easily access alternative options, which is why the act was necessary. It's really to place in tandem with the nearly identical piece of legislation in New York to help shift supplier practices, because this class of insecticide has really become so widespread that they're used whether or not pests are present. So I think here in Vermont, we can and should ensure that we're only using these pesticides when they are truly needed, and that we have a clear and workable process to support that goal. So I just wanted to walk through what Act 182 actually is requiring the Agency of Ag to do, where the current draft rule is falling a bit short, and highlighting a few areas where we have some concerns where the rule could be improved to better align with the intent of the legislation. The rule is not just meant to be an educational document or a list of recommendations. The agency is tasked with creating enforceable best management practices for neonic use that may continue in agriculture in Vermont, which includes seed treatments used before the prohibition goes into effect in 2029. It includes uses that are allowed under an exemption from the agency, and it also includes agricultural uses not otherwise touched by the law after July 1st of this year. And then the agency is also tasked with working with farmers and seed companies to ensure that other alternatives and untreated options are available. So I was just going to go through some of the points that I had given you in the written testimony about what's in the current draft rule and what I would like to see in it based on getting it to align better with the intent of Act 182. The first being a pretty simple one, which is that the current draft shows that the implementation starts in 2031, which is 2 years after the bill says that it should start, because the phase out is in 2029. So that should be corrected. That seems like a small mistake. And then sort of a broader commentary, which is that all of the draft rules currently written as voluntary language. It's in should rather than shall, even when it's referring to statutory requirements like around disposal and drift and pollinator protection. So where appropriate, these rules should have some enforceable language around practices that are required. One of those things that we've been thinking about in particular is around disposal of excess treated seed. So excess treated seed, these are basically poison pills for birds, and they end up, if they're left on the surface, they can harm birds and other wildlife. If they're buried improperly or too shallow or too close to a well or to water, they can contaminate that water. So we believe the rule should require that disposal should occur a specified distance away from drinking water from wells, in particular, wetlands, other sensitive areas. In other areas, they're able to ask that growers take their seeds to a lined landfill. We only have one of those in Vermont, so that's not practical. That's not cost effective. Burial ends up being probably the most cost effective way of dealing with excess seed. Minnesota is currently going through rulemaking for how to safely dispose of treated seed, and they have much more clear guidance around how to do that. For example, burial at least 200 feet from a private well, tile drain inlet or open water, and 1,000 feet from a public water supply well. So since over 40% of Vermonters source their water from private wells, we'd like to see that rule clearly outline how to protect drinking water when disposal is taking place on the farm. My well is less than 50 feet from my property line in an area that was continuous corn for 15 years. I would love to see that, burial occurring farther from where that wellhead is.
Representative O'Brien has a question.
Yeah,
Is it okay to break in?
Yeah.
Oh,
feel free.
like, why is should being used in the language when we've heard, like, as certified applicators, you need to follow the labels and they're very strict about what you should do. So it seems like certified applicators and the labels on these pesticides have a much higher standard than we're putting in rules.
Right. And some of the things that are in should language in the rules are even on the label as something that is required. So I think that will be hopefully tightened through the process of public input on the rule. I think the agency sees that as an area where there's some room for negotiation, moving some shoulds into shalls.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're not starting with, let's align with the labels.
No. And I would like to see the rule say something to the effect of where the label is more restrictive, we should go for the more restrictive, or where the rule is more restrictive, we should go for the more protective of the two options.
Yeah. I'm just looking at the rule and under the disposal section, it talks about using in accordance with the label. It doesn't seem to say burying. It says further down, you shouldn't compost, which
Right.
could be confusing. But does
Yeah.
the label typically say bury it?
The label has, I believe, some guidance around how it can be buried, or that it can be buried on farm, but not details around things like drinking water.
Since from
Yeah, the labels when it comes to treated seed are very limited. And often, at least my understanding is that seed tag that's on the actual bag that you're getting has a QR code that directs you to the actual information about the pesticide. Whether or not that pesticide label is actually downloaded and read is another question. As opposed to it being read on the pesticide, container for most other pesticides.
you would need to have the ability to.
Yeah, to actually get to that. Mhm.
Most of us have that, but not everybody.
My dad has a flip phone. I don't think he would be able to get a QR code to work. So any other questions at this point? I have a couple more things and then can open it up. The other thing, and I think this is probably be a bigger issue, is that the draft rule should really better address uses that go beyond seed treatments. I think the agency's been thinking mostly about seed treatments because that's the biggest portion of the bill, but it does address other things as well. There are uses that are going to be prohibited as of July of this year. And so there should be language for BMPs for those uses under an exemption process that we don't really understand yet. And also uses that are not otherwise prohibited after July 1st. So there are very few sort of clear or enforceable practices for those other scenarios. And most of the specific language in the rules is related to the use of seed treatments. So there are other high-risk uses that were prohibited under Act 182, such as applications to crops in flower, applications to ornamental plants. So if those uses are going to be granted exemptions, there needs to be a distinct set of best practices for those uses, because those are particularly high risk to pollinators, including but not limited to advanced notification of nearby beekeepers before use of a neonic under exemption. That was one thing that Andrew specifically wanted to make sure was in this testimony, was advanced notification. And then, yes, thinking about the other uses of neonics in agriculture that could be affected by this rule and where risks to pollinators could potentially be reduced by a set of best practices. In particular, the rule should clarify how it's addressing high-risk uses in nursery production. Act 182 includes language that covers applications to ornamental plants, but the draft rule doesn't clearly address how it applies to nursery production. And nationally, neonics are used frequently in nurseries, often applied to plants that bloom while they're, after application or while they're still in pots, which can pose high risks to bees or to butterflies that are using those plants as food. So that's one area. And then the final thing, and this was something we brought up with AIB, but the rule should prohibit aerial application of neonics. The draft rules are pointing to existing regulations on aerial applications in the rule for control of pesticides. Based on those rules, aerial applications have to have a 50-foot buffer from pollinator habitat. But a 50-foot buffer for a high drift scenario like aerial application really isn't sufficient for these very highly toxic insecticides. So if the agency wants to create some kind of different buffer for a drone application that's got a lower drift potential, I could see that. But if they're needing to make a blanket decision on aerial applications of all kinds, one way or another, it should err on the side of caution and prohibit aerial application of neonics.
Aerial application would mean from a plane.
From a plane or
or from a drone or from
Under the current definition of aerial, yeah.
Representative O'Brien.
That was my question. So it's not spraying it from, farm machinery.
No, it would be from an aircraft of some kind in the air. Yeah, and which I think would be pretty limited in Vermont. I don't know the extent of it, but I can't imagine there's very many aerial applicators of neonics.
But it's done
But it could be done.
in the Midwest, do they do?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Millions of acres for soybean aphid.
Even when they're treated article seeds to begin with?
Yes. So that's kind of what's in the draft rule as it stands. The other thing that we've been thinking about is that the rule doesn't outline the process for receiving an exemption from the prohibitions, both for the things that are prohibited as of July and for neonic seed treatments in 2029. And as I understand it, that's going to be kind of an ongoing process as we learn more from Extension about the seed research and in coordination with New York and other partners. So I'm hoping that results in a process that is grounded in evidence and consistent with the intent of the act. But really want the exemptions to be reserved for situations where there's a documented need of some kind. There's then that pest risk assessment that was in the act. And where the grower is taking steps to implement IPM practices, like scouting and monitoring for the seed pests, using thresholds based on UVM research, using cultural practices. So the details do matter. And if there isn't a good exemption process, the point of the act was to try to end the prophylactic use that's not grounded in an economic benefit for the grower and that isn't grounded in any kind of documented pest pressure. So hoping that process ends up being a good one from the agency. And so if the BMPs are meant to support that process, they do need to be a little more clear and more enforceable. They don't mention any of those things that were in the statute about the pest risk assessment or really IPM practices that should be in place under an exemption for the use of treated seeds. They say that growers should learn about which practices increase or reduce pest risk, but that's not the same as putting them into practice. Same with the prohibitions for neonic uses as of July this year, things like blooming crops, ornamentals. The statute is pretty clear that if the agency is evaluating that there's no other less harmful pesticide or pest management practice that would be effective for those exempted uses. So we don't really know what that process looks like. That standard is important and it should be integrated into how those decisions are made. So these changes are really about making sure that the neonic use that may continue is justified, targeted, and as low risk as possible. These are highly toxic chemicals that persist for a long time in the environment. They're very mobile. So this is what the act was asking for. This is what we're hoping the rule is going to deliver. And I just wanted to end by saying that I really value the time and energy that growers are putting into feeding their animals, feeding our communities, caring for the land. And I also believe strongly that we can reduce pesticide risk and protect pollinators while maintaining the viability of our farms. And that, in fact, these steps are necessary to protect long-term viability of pollinator life and soil life over the long term. So I appreciate the opportunity. Happy to take questions, talk about it.
Thank you. Questions?
Well, you do most of the treated article seeds sold with neonics on them. Do they also now, almost all of them have diamides also, or you can sort of pick your, because I've heard there's some that have both.
There are some that have both. Right now, they're moving towards stacking as many traits as possible and as many coatings as possible onto the same seed.
So fungicides.
Yeah, fungicides as well, but also neonics and diamides, with diamides being another class of insecticides that is probably the successor to neonics on seeds. Right now, they're stacking both of them together in some places for some seeds. Which interestingly, in New York, one of the only crop failures last year was on a stacked soybean fields with both neonics and diamides on it, which I thought was interesting. Possible impacts on the other insects that provide pest control, for example, in that field. These seed treatments don't just affect pollinators; they also affect ground beetles and other things that are in the soil that do important jobs. So that's when I'm talking about agricultural resilience, that's one of the things I think about soil life.
Speaking of that, are neonics used in certain cases to fight emerald ash borer?
Yes.
There's a spray or injection or drench, or can you just talk to that?
Yeah, there's a few different things that are used for a trunk injection for emerald ash borer and eventually spotted lanternfly once that reaches our area. But some of them are abamectin. Emamectin benzoate is actually one of the big ones, which is a different class of systemic insecticide, the avermectins. But imidacloprid and other neonics are used for trunk injection for tree pests. Yeah, or hemlock woody dudgeon as well.
Is that part of the rulemaking?
So I believe it depends on whether you consider landscape trees to be ornamentals. But yes, I think it's something that I would like to see addressed in the rule is the trunk injection use and an exemption process for agricultural or environmental emergencies for those uses, right? So that's built into the act is that there should be available exemptions for those kinds of emergency uses. But no, I don't believe that trunk injection was dealt with in the draft rule. That was in the recommendations we put forward to AIB. So they are in those set practices recommended.
Can you, Emily, speak to the process at all? I feel like we may not be, I'm not anyway.
I'm not,
Yeah,
I'm here talking to you about policy and I'm not.
Okay, well, I don't mean to put you on the spot either.
Okay, I think the next step is ICAR, which is the something committee on administrative rulemaking.
Yeah, the interagency.
Interagency Committee on Administrative Rulemaking.
Okay.
And then that was on the agenda for this month's ICAR meeting, but they didn't end up getting to it. And so it'll be on next month's ICAR meeting agenda. And then there's an opportunity for public comment on the rule after it's been publicly established through ICAR.
Okay.
And I think there's some time limit to that process. And then after ICAR, it goes to LCAR, the Legislative Committee on
Right.
Administrative Rulemaking.
The timing is an issue because the ban goes into effect on July 1st.
Correct.
So the moment, and I mean, it sounds like based on the fact that there's next month, sometime in June, and then some sort of a public comment period, which is usually 30 days or 45 days, that July 1st will come and we won't have rules in place.
Right. So the restriction will be in place, but the rules won't be in place for it.
Yes, right. So for example, the exemption rules. And so the statute did say there should be rulemaking around the exemption process. And the draft rule doesn't have that at all.
I don't think the statute spelled out that there needed to be rulemaking for the exemption process. My understanding is the agency is thinking about that more as guidance rather than a rulemaking process for the exemption part. But there are a lot of things that are specifically built into the statutory language about what has to be in the exemption process.
pulled up the bill from last year as enacted, it does seem to say, after consultation with the AIB, shall adopt rules. And then there's a list of things, treated seeds, when the secretary issues an exemption.
Mhm.
So, and then just pesticides. Yeah. Okay, well, in any case, it sounds like you have some recommendations. They've been submitted to the agency or to the AIB. They will use them as they see fit. And then do you typically, would your organization testify, provide public comment, or?
We will probably provide public comment.
Yes, yeah.
I think we could expect that.
All right, other questions? Representative Burke?
If you can speak to this or not, but are they able to source seed in New York that doesn't have neonics on it that meet the needs of the growers there for corn or soybean currently?
So I think that this is part of why it's helpful to have the phase-in timeline to figure it out. It is already possible if you're well in advance, let's say September, to a special order seed that has, no treatment on it or a particular treatment on it. The tricky part ends up being in situations like where we're in right now, where maybe you need to exchange for a shorter season variety because you haven't been able to get corn in the ground and you're trying to order seeds right now or swap them out. So I think there's a lot of things to figure out. It's part of why this act was able to be passed was that it's hinging on New York figuring it out at the same time with 1 million acres of corn, to shift the supplier availability and compliance in that area to offer options where there are currently not options.
And are any projections on cost difference, having like sort of a custom corn seed made for growers? It's kind of surprising how much some of these larger dairy farms are paying just for the seed as it is right now. So I don't know.
Right.
Any projections on that?
So I think it's hard to make projections on that. The example that I can give you is from Quebec, which is where growers have had a prohibition on neonics on their seeds for 5-6 years now. And where they have switched away from using the neonic seed treatments, they're seeing a cost savings because they're no longer having to have that pesticide on the seed. And some growers who initially switched to diamides as the replacement option in Quebec have switched away from using any insecticide on the seed. And they're seeing a cost savings from that without yield failure. So I think there are hopeful examples. Yeah.
Given it's another year's gone by now, is there anything research-wise on neonics and pollinators and?
I think the most recent thing I saw was actually about carabid beetles, the ground beetles that live in fields. There was new research I just saw come out this month about how the neonic seed treatments can suppress that activity of ground beetles in fields that are doing things like preying on other insects in the field and eating weed seeds. But in terms of neonics and pollinators, the evidence on that front is pretty overwhelming. The other thing that came out in the interim was there were a couple papers tying neonic use sort of across nationally at the county level to butterfly declines at the national level. So I think this act was really important. I'm hoping that it ends up being helpful, meaningful to Vermont bees and other insects.
I have one other question. I don't know. I know we had conversation last year about injection into tree trunks. We didn't go deeply into it because we intended that to not be part of what we were restricting or banning. So I don't know that we heard testimony on the safety or concerns that the pollinator community might have over that application method. And it seems like if you're putting I don't know exactly how it works physically, but if you're like literally injecting something into a tree, seems like that's a different application, would have different effect than spray, for example.
Yes. So there's different exposure routes for pollinators depending on how something is applied. So when we're talking about seed treatments, the exposure routes are from dust off when you're planting or from it getting in the soil and water and then into plants in the surrounding area and then into nectar and pollen that they're taking back. With trunk injections, it's contained in the sense it doesn't have drift, but it does end up being preserved in that tissue for a long time because it's protected from UV breakdown. So what you end up with is kind of a high rate of an insecticide that stays in the plant for a long period of time. So timing is really important with trunk injections because if you're doing, let's say, a trunk injection in the springtime, that's when it would end up in nectar and pollen of that tree at potentially very high levels. Whereas if you do, let's say, a midsummer application, the impact to pollinators might be less, except for the ones that are feeding on the tree, like a butterfly or a moth caterpillar, right? But for the bees that are coming in the springtime and picking up nectar and pollen, that's going to be a lesser amount showing up there than if it had been applied before the flowering season of the tree. So it depends on the chemical and the rate of application and all of that. But there have been examples of both soil drenches and trunk injections persisting from a fall application into nectar and pollen the next year at rates that are still toxic to a pollinator.
Right. Was there anything else you wanted to add? I think we.
I'm sorry that Representative Nelson is not here to provide his input on this. I was interested in his take.
Well, maybe two of you can chat offline.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Feel free at any point if you have questions, reach out. Okay.
All right, so the written testimony is available, I'm sorry, the handout is available on our website and if anyone, maybe we can get the rule too, because we talked about that a little bit, we can get that onto today's web page as well, so that if anybody's watching and wants to see that, they can track that down easily. So we'll do that. That's all we have for this afternoon. I think it's been an early day. We're scheduled to be back here tomorrow at 9:30, and we're going to be looking at a report. And I think Steve Dwight is coming in from the agency. This is a report that was legislated last year and was sent to Ways and Means. Involves the fee structure for online testing. You remember we talked about that last year? So Ways and Means asked if we could take a look at it because they were busy. Yeah, they had other things that they were trying to accomplish. So I said, sure, we can take a quick look at that. Depending on how things go, we may have other legislation to look at tomorrow. I'm not quite sure. And then we are going to look at H403, which is not a bill that's in our committee, but it involves agricultural workers. So I was asked if we could just spend a little time with that. So we will do that tomorrow. Then we'll be on the floor at 1:00. We will not be here in the afternoon. My intent anyway for the rest of the session is that we won't be coming in after the floor.
Or a morning committee.
Yeah, we're a morning committee. The whole schedule gets thrown up in the air though, starting on Friday. And then I think the rest of the session will be meeting at 10 every day on the floor. So we may then have time between 10 and lunch where we come in to deal with things that we have to deal with. I don't think we may schedule something, but probably not, except bills that we need to look at.
Does the Senate have any bills that we need to-
Yes, in fact, they still do have H484, which is the miscellaneous ag bill with the beneficial substances. They have amended it. So we will presumably be getting that back. I don't think any earlier than Friday. So that right now that's not on the agenda just because we haven't But we may have some time either tomorrow or with Michael Grady to look at things that are in that bill that we haven't seen, just so we have some time. As we learned with the H401, when a bill comes back from the Senate, it goes right onto the calendar. And we are, we don't have the luxury of taking lots of testimony. We can, if we need to, we can sort of slow things down, but generally speaking, try to move things along. So anything that we can do ahead of time might be useful on that bill too. Otherwise, good. So we'll see everybody tomorrow, 9:30. I guess keep an eye on your text and email just in case something comes up with something that we have to look at first thing. Before that, I don't